it's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Mr. Martin Eakes. And before I give a little bit of background on Martin Eakes, I'm going to give an apology in advance, which is that I've been scheduled to be two places at once, so I can only stay for a few minutes after the introduction. So please don't take my having to leave as an illustration of lack of interest. I think we're really privileged to have a speaker of the caliber of Martin this evening. I simply have to be two places at once. So Martin Eakes is the co-founder and CEO of Self-Help, which is the co-founder of Self-Help, which is a community development lender, founded in 1980. Self-Help has provided over $5 billion with a B in financing to 55,000 homeowners, small businesses, and nonprofits. Those are pretty impressive numbers just to start out with. Mr. Eakes holds a law degree from Yale, a master's from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs at Princeton, and a BA from Davidson College. He is a native of North Carolina and is a nationally recognized expert on development finance. And he has been honored by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation as a MacArthur Fellow for his work. So it's great to see that sort of external recognition as well. In 1998, Mr. Eakes also helped formulate the Coalition for Responsible Lending, which is a coalition of 120 financial institution CEOs and 86 organizations to stop predatory lending practices in North Carolina and nationally, which if you've been here for some time, you know has been a really important issue. In 2005, Martin Eakes was named Tar Heel of the Year, and I'm sure of all of your accomplishments, that's the one that stands out, the Tar Heel of the Year in the Raleigh News and Observer. So please join me in welcoming Martin Eakes.
Good evening. I want to do some thank yous before I actually get started. Ann Alexander and Wendy McCorkle, where are you? Stand up and say hi. So they've helped put this event together, and earlier today there was an event for socially responsible investing, which we'll talk a little bit tonight. How many of you were at that earlier event? Good. And thanks to the Center for Sustainable Enterprise, it certainly is true that the world will not continue unless we figure out how to make our businesses and our endeavors more sustainable. And thank you for hosting this. I really want to thank the depositors of Self-Help Credit Union. So everyone here who has either been a board member, a depositor, a supporter, a funder, or a rock thrower of Self-Help, how about raising your hand? That's a pretty incredible group. And I feel like in some ways that Self-Help is a case study of how to use socially responsible investing, and without which we would have never been able to do any of the few things we've accomplished. And I'll talk about that more too. Where's Tim Smith? Tim, stand up. So Tim is president of the Social Investment Forum. He also pretends that he advises people on other investing, but he really is one of the leaders, the national leader for socially responsible investing and engagement, where he helps people do share owner resolutions, I learned in the last session, to help corporations see that they can change their ways and be more socially accountable. So Tim, on behalf of everyone here representing socially responsible investing, let me thank you and recognize you. Before I really jump into the substance, I want to start off by saying how much I am glad to be back in North Carolina. The introduction talking about the Tar Heel of the Year was really interesting because a year ago I was given an honorary degree by Duke. And so when I stood up, I had this very hard time explaining to them, well, Tar Heel has two different meanings and I'm proud of both of them. So people who know how much I really love to talk are really surprised at how much I hate to give speeches. I've heard that the #1 fear in America is having to stand up and give a speech. What most people don't then tell you is the #2 fear is having to sit there and listen to one. So I always thought that I was this very plain-speaking person until I went to New York City to start law school. And I drove up in my old 1965 Buick, parked out on the street, and went inside to order a roast beef sandwich. And I ordered it, and the guy at the counter, this crusty old New Yorker, he said, "Hold it right there, Sonny, don't say another word." And he went back to the back, and he called everyone out of the back to come forward, and he got everybody out there, and he says, "Okay, now just say it again. I want to hear it." So I ordered again, not really understanding exactly what was going on. He says, "Oh, God, I love that Southern accent. You must be from the deep, deep South." And I'm thinking, well, you know, North Carolina, I guess that qualifies. And then he continued, he said, "Are you from Delaware?" So it tells you something about your perspective. I recently gave a speech in Maine, and I looked at people, and they get this grimace on their face, and they were thinking, they looked confused. And I was thinking, do I need to slow down? Am I talking too fast? And they said, "Oh, please, God, don't speak any slower than you are now." So I tell people I'm really pleased and proud to be a Southerner. I tell people I was born here, I was raised here, I was educated here, and I raised my children here. And when I die, I'm going to insist before I die, that I have a Southern preacher, Southern Baptist preacher, to speak at my funeral, because that's the only way I know for certain I'll get 2 or 3 more hours than I deserve before I have to move on. The message that I want to talk about is one that people who know me have heard, and that is the message of servant leadership, and what I call just showing up and being there when you're really needed by little people. I call it servant leadership because I think it brings this air of humility, not just service leadership. And I read this statement recently that said that humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's simply thinking about yourself less. And for me, being there when needed is not this great master plan of life, but is really a recognition that your greatest contribution, my greatest contribution, will come on a day, an ordinary day, when someone needs me and I'm there to step up, when it was not part of a big master plan, but it was my moment to step forward, and it was not planned. A couple more stories before I get all serious on you. The first one is a story that shows you what your perspective can be depending on what your wealth position is. And this is a story about a Texas rancher who came to North Carolina at a conference and met this very small tenant farmer from North Carolina. And the Texas rancher started to brag. Who all's from Texas here? I'm picking on Texas a little bit. Okay, but it's fun. And the Texas rancher started bragging about the size of his ranch. He says, "I can stand in the middle of my property and look in every direction and not see another person's land." He says, "Just yesterday I started on one side of my property at 6 in the morning and I drove for 8 hours and never got across my own property." And the tenant farmer from North Carolina looked up at him with great sympathy, and he says, "Yeah, I know just how you feel. I used to have a truck just like that too." So one more story. There was this young man who showed up for jury duty as instructed by the written notice that he had received, and he was really agitated and fidgeting and restless until he just couldn't wait any longer. And he jumped up and addressed the judge. He says, "Your Honor, you have to excuse me. I just can't stay here any longer. My wife went to the hospital this morning and is right now conceiving a baby." The judge looked at the young man with some empathy and he said, "I think what you mean to say is that your wife is delivering a baby." And the young juror, with great vehemence, jumps up and he says, "No, I mean she is conceiving a baby." And the judge just shook his head and he says, "Young man, I've never done this before, but I'm going to excuse you because either way, you need to be there." So you'll remember what you need to be there for, if nothing else. What I want to do is tell you a little bit about self-help. and some of the stories along the way, and then shift at the end and talk to you about the Center for Responsible Lending, which is the affiliate of Self-Help that does advocacy work trying to stop abusive financial practices across the country. I always start with a quote that came from my mother. My mother used to say to me, "If you have the vision to see a problem, you have the duty to help solve it." If you have the vision to see a problem, you have the duty to help solve it. Now, for me, I'm one of these people. I made a joke one time in a speech that I couldn't get to work with two socks that match. And I thought I was, being cute, and I looked down, and my socks matched, but I had forgotten to wear a belt. So I can't claim to be a great manager or a great visionary, certainly not any fashion sense whatsoever. But my mother, I think, instilled in me this great gift and great curse, because I do have the vision to see problems and know how some of them need to be solved. When Self-Help got started in 1980, it was my wife and I. We were both I was 25, she was 22. I had just finished law school and graduate school, and I had articulated that I had been in education for almost 21 years of my life, educating my mind, including kindergarten, which was my favorite and most successful year. But I had hardly had a moment of formally educating the heart. And so my wife and I started Self-Help in 1980, about as blissfully ignorant as any two people could be, but very idealistic of what we could accomplish in North Carolina. We believed that the legal phase of the civil rights movement and women's movement had largely been won, but that legal gains alone, without translating that into the economic arena, would be almost completely meaningless. So that's what we started, with a vision that we were going to help translate the women's movement and the civil rights movement into the economic arena. And because I saw Bill Bondurant, where's Bill? He's right here. I'm going to tell you this embarrassing story. I wrote the first grant proposal for Self-Help while I was still in graduate school. I had been a philosophy and physics major as an undergraduate. And I wrote this paper that was entitled, "How to Reconcile Socialism and Capitalism." So we had really grand plans for what we were going to do to start out. This is before the Iron Curtain had fallen. And I think Bill and the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, these two foundations in Winston-Salem, were the very first two foundations that I went to. I took this proposal and I walked in, and they sat down and they asked me, they said, "Well, do you have a board?" I said, "Well, yeah, I have some board members. And have you had anybody in this state who's asked for your services?" I said, "Well, not yet, but we have to start somewhere." And I'm thinking, these are the most cynical people that I have ever encountered. What's wrong with them? And why can't they just support what's going to be this great? Well, needless to say, they didn't fund that proposal. The next year I came back. I'm driving my little blue Volkswagen Bug. I go in. I think I actually, it may have been the same suit that I still have, but I by then had a suit. And I went in. I feel like I've had this great meeting, and they've asked questions. I've actually had a couple of answers. And I go back out, and I'm thinking, I might get this grant. We'd asked for $12,000 to be able to pay for a full-time staff person at that time. And I go back out, and I pat my pockets, as I always do generally when I get out of the car and when I start to get back in the car, and I can't find my keys to my car. And I look in the window, and there, dangling from the key with the doors locked, are my keys sitting in the ignition. So my thought was, and what do you think? I have one of two choices. I either break a window, salvage my pride, and drive back to Durham from Winston-Salem, or I go in the foundation and ask somebody for help. Okay, who thinks that I asked for help? Who thinks I broke a window? Okay, well, those of you who know me know the answer, because I am so cheap. There was no way I'm going to break a perfectly good window. And I went inside and borrowed, this was actually Joe Kilpatrick, borrowed not only did I go in and ask him for help, I said, "I need your car." I'm going to drive your car back halfway to Durham and get an extra set of keys and then drive back to get my car. And it turned out that this foundation director became one of the great allies to us over the years. And I think it was out of pity that he was afraid that if they didn't give us a grant, we might starve to death. The very first project, and where is Justin? Where's my son? Is here too somewhere. So this is my inspiration. I told him I wouldn't embarrass him too much. But since I'm about to tell a tale on his mother, I've got to at least try to isolate him temporarily. So my wife, who has real artistic talent, but did not demonstrate it on this first occasion, drew a brochure for the first self-help brochure that had farm implements on the front of it and called the Center for Community Self-Help. And I got to tell you, it was the ugliest brochure that I have ever seen. And it's not because she can't draw. It was probably because of what I directed her to put on it. And we sent out 100 of them. That's all the budget we had. 100 brochures we had printed on a mimeograph machine and sent them around. I got a call from a group in New Bern, North Carolina, who got me on the phone. I still haven't passed the bar exam. I'm living at my parents' house in Greensboro, trying to get this nonprofit started. And I get this call that says, we got a copy of your brochure. And honest to God, my first thought was, how is that possible? How could anyone outside of Greensboro get a copy of this? They said, well, we got your brochure, and it says what you provide as services is exactly what we need. I said, okay, now what? And the guy said, well, we want you to come down and meet with some of us in New Bern, North Carolina. Our industrial plant has just shut down, and we want to meet with you to talk about setting up an employee-owned business in New Bern. So I drove down to the coast, showed up at a high school where they told me to meet them, went into the parking lot and was looking around for the athletic game because the parking lot was completely full with cars, and it's about 5:30 in the evening. And someone came to meet me and took me to the corner of the gymnasium and led me inside, which was where the small group was going to meet with me. When I got there, there were 500 employees, and each of them had an average of 2 family members. There were 1,500 people standing in this gymnasium. And they led me up and introduced me as, this is the person who's going to save our jobs. So when people ask me, as an introvert, do you get really nervous speaking? I said, I used to. And I stood up and I told them, I said, you know, I don't really know how to help you here exactly. And they told me their story. They said, we had our industrial plant shut down last Friday, and we were given a notice, every one of us at the same time, no notice whatsoever of our factory shutting down. And the only way for us to have a job is for us to take matters into our own hands and start our own business and own this business that has now shut down. And I have never been more terrified in my whole life. I went and I said, well, I will do the best I can. And this one person stood up and he says, well, you don't seem like you're all that good, but you are the best we've got. And I thought about that for the notion of being there, that sometimes you don't have to be the best in the world. You just have to be the best that they've got, that you have to try. So I drove back to Greensboro to meet with the head of this company, not knowing any better. I'm just out of law school. Like I said, I hadn't passed the bar exam, so I'm not responsible yet. And I drive in and sit in the lobby and get ushered to the receptionist's office for the CEO of this conglomerate company. And I'm there, and she asked me, she says, well, do you have an appointment? And I said, well, no, I don't have an appointment, but I have a very important mission. She says, you can't see the CEO if you don't have an appointment. This is a multi-billion-dollar company. And I looked at her, and the poor folks from Self-Help have already heard this story before. I looked at her and I said, you know, there's one thing about me that you need to know that's just really unusual, and I can't account for it. But I can go almost a week without eating. And she's looking at me, and I said, and I'm going to sit in this chair for a week if that's what it takes until he comes out and meets with me. And I sat there from 9 that morning until 7 that night. But unlike the big New York CEO offices where they have 2 exits, this guy couldn't get out without coming by me. So at 7 o'clock, he comes out and he says, well, come on in, you win. And he took me, and it didn't take him more than about 20 minutes to run through the numbers. And this is the part that is embarrassing for those of you who are my age and older, is he told me what this industrial plant made. It made yarn that went into bell-bottom, double knit, polyester slacks. Okay, now who here will admit that they remember that 6-month period? So I drove back to New Bern and was met at the door as I went back into this gymnasium again with all the same people there a week later. And one of my mentors met me at the door and he said, Martin, don't you dare tell the people here what you learned, because your job is to instill hope in these folks who have no hope at this point. And I looked at him even as a 25-year-old youngster and I said, no, you've got that wrong. My job is to tell the people the truth, no matter what it is, no matter how painful. And I went in and told them. And I thought I was gone. I was getting ready to leave. I was finished. And this group surrounded me of about 15 workers. And this one guy came up to me, and he had this big beard down to his waist. He's about 6'4", huge guy. And he stuttered as he spoke. I mean, I thought he looked, I tell people he looked to me like my image of Che Guevara. I had a very romantic vision of what, who all these people were. And he looks at me and he says, Martin, I have always wanted to start a small business. I was on a naval ship as a baker. And I've always wanted to start a commercial bakery. I was disabled in World War II. And I want to start this bakery. And you're going to help us. It wasn't a request. You're going to help us. And I said, well, I don't know anything about bakeries except I really do like donuts. I really like donuts. He said, well, donuts are what we're going to make. Well, to make a story a little bit shorter so that we get to the end, this guy refused to say no. We were turned down at 7 different banks for a loan. We got enough money from the state government committed to the town of New Bern to buy the first bakery equipment, and the town of New Bern on a 3-2 vote decided to turn it down, 3 whites to 2 blacks. And they voted it down because the business was going to be located in an area that was not all black, and the workforce of this group that had started was all black. This was 1981, so it wasn't that long ago. And I really was ready to give up, and this fella, his name was Percy White, he ordered a tractor-trailer load of orange carpet cleaner, which he put in his garage, and he took me around to show me the carpet cleaner, and he says, I'm going to sell this door to door if it takes me the next 5 years in order to raise enough money to start my bakery. And he called me and he said, I'm coming to Durham. I've got surgery. Will you come visit me? And I went to see him at the Veterans Administration Hospital. This guy's, he's 30 years older than I am. Hard to imagine now that anyone could be 30 years older than me. And I walk in, and this guy's flat on his back, and he sees me, and he beckons me to come over near him. And I go up, and he pulls my lapel, pulls my face down to his, and he says, Martin, all I need is $1,700 more, and I can start the bakery. So the whole time that he'd been in surgery under the knife, the only thing that had kept him going was this dream of starting his bakery. And we went back, and the 4 people who were now working at Self-Help, who had a total budget of $4,000, we had $4,000 budget, and we took $1,700 and made our first loan to the New Bern Bakery Company, which started and ran. And the very first cake that the New Bern Bakery Company ever made, he came to a conference that was much, much smaller than this group and raffled the cake for $77 and came and delivered the $77 to me with this statement. I'm expecting this eloquent. He says, Martin, I give you this $77 as the first capital of the Self-Help Credit Union so that no person, because of the color of their skin or where they happen to live in a rural area, will ever have to sell liquid carpet cleaner ever again to start their business. So that was the beginning of the Self-Help Credit Union, and immediately thereafter, we had 30 Catholic church orders and other churches from around the country who made the first deposits in Self-Help Credit Union. And I have said to people, you know, I will die, go to hell, come back before any depositor ever loses a penny at Self-Help Credit Union. But it was mainly thinking about these Catholic nuns in particular who didn't have much. They really didn't have that much money, but they said, we're going to put it with you. And this was back at a time, Self-Help Credit Union pays really high interest rates. But back then, it was 2%. And they were saying, we don't think we even need to receive 2%. You should pay us less. I'm like, well. But they were willing to take a risk on real people and put funds, and I think of that as really the epitome of what social investing means. They knew that their funds would at least be insured, so that if we were as crazy as we looked, they would at least get their money back. They might not get all the interest, but they knew they'd get their money back. And I feel like I tell this story everywhere I go because I want people to know the heart and soul of what community development organizations really care about and what they work for. We had an earlier session and talked about the Latino Community Credit Union, which if I were telling you today, if you had one place to put idle funds that you have, put it there. They have grown in 5 years from zero to $50-some million and 55,000 members that they are assisting, almost all of whom never have had a bank account in their whole life. Most of them are undocumented immigrants. And so I get, you know, I'm thinking, why don't they get as many threats as I get? I get these threats from people who say, we're going to come and burn you or chase you or destroy you. And I'm thinking, you know, we've got human beings here. There's no such thing as an illegal person. We've got people who work in hospitals but can't go to hospitals themselves. They work to build houses, but they can't get loans to own their own. There's something just morally wrong in that picture. And so I'm really proud to be associated with the Latino Community Credit Union. It's just half a block from Self-Help. But those are the kinds of institutions that I think the socially responsible investment movement nationwide have helped to spawn all across the nation. I finally learned why self-help was such an inspiring story when I had a workshop that I was doing in Milwaukee, and this was years ago. And I showed up and we were talking about how to set up housing cooperatives in the city of Milwaukee. And at the end of a long day, this guy, he's a blue-collar worker, he stood up and he looked at me, and I, at that point, as hard as this is to believe, had really long, curly red hair that came down to about my shoulders. I look at that, people shaking in disbelief over there. And this guy stood up and he says, you know, I know all these crazy experiments that take place in California and in Massachusetts. And then he looked over at me, he says, but I don't see why North Carolina should be ahead of us on a damn thing. And I'm thinking, well, I think he meant that as a compliment. And I think what he meant was that if somebody like me and the original staff of Self-Help could make progress, that really anybody can do it. And I tell people now, Self-Help has 250 staff people, and they are the most brilliant, committed, wonderful people. And the real advantage for those of you students who are thinking about starting your own is it really pays to get there first, because you don't have to be as smart as all the people who come later. You just have to hire them. The story of Self-Help is a powerful one. It's grown. It's one of the largest community development lending organizations in the country. We have $1 billion in assets and another $1 billion of home loans that we've made and take credit risk for, which makes us about the size of one or two really good-sized Bank of America branches. So I understand the relative nature. What I want to do is tell you 2 or 3 things that I think I've learned and then jump into the predatory lending. The first thing that I feel like over 27 years of doing this work that I feel like I have learned, and this sounds obvious but it's really not, is that you can't solve poverty without focusing on wealth. So almost all of American anti-poverty policy is aimed at income status, not family assets. So it looks at programs for food stamps or medical coverage or aid to families with dependent children. And in fact, you can be penalized if you're a family that has more wealth than a car or even a car, that you get your benefit packages cut back. And what I feel like I have learned over these years is that there is simply no way that a family can have security without some modest level of assets in the family. So self-help became interested in home ownership back in 1984, not because we really cared about shelter per se, but we cared about home ownership because that's where 60% of the wealth is held by by black families, Latino families, and white families. So that if we wanted to have an impact on family wealth, we simply had to figure out a way to expand home ownership to a broader group of people. For most families of modest means, owning a home is the only narrow single path into the middle class, and even that path is really quite difficult. Most parents think that if I can spend a lifetime owning a home, at the end of that lifetime, I will have built up something that I can now pass to my children. I tell the story of a self-help annual meeting where a borrower stood up and told her story. I think you were there. She stood up and said, she says, I am now 57 years old. I have worked every single day of my life since I was 14 years old at a 9-to-5 job. Didn't finish high school. I'm the child of 2 alcoholic parents. I've got 3 children. I'm a single mother. And I have raised my children to adulthood and never been able to buy a home. She says, I was able to come and get a first home loan from self-help to buy my first home. And when I went home with the keys, I did something that may surprise you. She said, I didn't go and sleep in my own bed that first night. What I did was I sat in the living room and I watched the thermostat, which had a little red light whenever it came on and off. I watched the thermostat go on and off the entire night long. And she said, and the reason that was so important to me was that every night when I had raised my children during a cold winter, I had had to open the door of an oven in the kitchen. I knew that every night that I did that I was risking my children's lives, that we could wake up the next morning and they and me not be alive. But it was the only heat we had. It was the only thing that we had. And so when I looked at this thermostat showing the heat coming on and off all night long, automatically, for me it was a thing of magic and a thing of beauty. Because I knew that my children could bring their children and visit their grandmother and never have the fear that they would wake up in a fire. So the simple truth is this: income gives a family the ability to make short-term choices. And assets give a family the ability to make long-term choices, whether to start a business or send a child to college. Some of the single mothers that self-help made loans to, our initial period, we made 1,000 home loans to almost all single minority mothers. And we had not a single loss. In 11 years, we had not one single loan. And all the bankers and friends of mine when we started had told me, you can't do this. You'll absolutely lose everything that you've got. But what I knew, and what has made us look at self-help like we're geniuses, is that if you have faith in people who are working for a living, they will repay you each and every time. They will do everything in their power to pay you back. I had single mothers who came back to me 10 years later after getting these first homes. Homes had gone up in value. And they borrowed against the homes in order to send their children as the first generation to be able to go to college. And for me, that's the essence of long-term human service. I'm going to skip my second lesson, go to the third, because I'm going to run out of time. what I really think is one of the most important things that we've learned from walking with people over the last 27 years is the following. I believe that suffering and self-sacrifice are really the essence of leadership and progress. Now that sounds really odd, doesn't it? No one seeks suffering or self-sacrifice, but suffering and loss have a way of finding us whether we seek it out or not. Self-sacrifice is a really different thing. That's something we choose to do out of love. I tell people I have talked to mothers in particularly poor neighborhoods who face random and predatory violence in their neighborhoods every day. And these mothers have told me that they pray each and every night for their sons. And they told me that their prayer is that their sons will simply live long enough to go to prison. And I looked at them, I said, because I've got 2 children, I said, that cannot be your prayer. As a parent, I was shocked. And what they told me was, there is a cure for a prison term. There is no cure for a bullet. So before John Edwards talked about it, I've said, all of us here have lived in 2 Americas our entire lives. One with wealth and choices, and one with poverty and pessimism and pain. It's just so real that it makes neighborhoods into killing fields. I tell this story, which in this audience will come close to home, that one of my best friends is a middle-class African-American man, a big man, a national leader in the community development world. Several years ago, he got this call on a Monday morning telling him he needed to come home. His son was 20 years old at that time. And he kept asking, what do I need to come home for? And people didn't want to tell him because the message was that his son had been murdered that morning in the mobile home that he lived in. There was nothing that I could do or anyone here could do except to be with our friend, to be there. But being there in times of suffering and pain is what creates the bonds that makes us human. Many years ago, I used to God, hold on here. Many years ago, I used to visit every weekend this family on the coast of North Carolina where I was helping them work on a small business. And I found out with this family that I was the only white person who had ever spent the night in their home. And it was the middle of winter. We were working on a business. And when I would get there, they had one heater in the middle of the house, a kerosene heater. And they'd crank this heater up. And I'd sleep back in the back bedroom, and it was 95 degrees or 100 degrees. And I was thinking, I didn't want to offend them, and I was thinking, I need to say something about the heat because it's killing me. But I was thinking, maybe there's something really weird about black people in heat. And so I was nervous and scared. But after about 3 or 4 weekends, I finally went to them. I said, do you think we might turn down the heat just a little bit at night? Of course, you know what the answer was, right? They looked at me and they said, hallelujah. We thought there was something really weird about white people in heat. I found out later from mutual friends in that community who told me, Martin, what you didn't realize during that time you were visiting is that family was so poor that they went the entire week in a really freezing winter with no heat whatsoever so that they would have enough kerosene to heat the house when you were there on the weekend. Now I ask you, what do you think I would not do for that family after knowing what they had sacrificed for me? And so what I tell people is if you will be there for the little people, they will be there for you when you need them. I saw this quote from St. Augustine who once said, we should preach the gospel wherever we go and use words only when necessary. It's a great quote. Here was a man with moral authority who knew that being there meant a whole lot more than just talking about a problem. So if it takes sacrifice to bring the African American and Latino home ownership rate to the national average, then so be it. Let's ask people to sacrifice. As leaders, we should sacrifice first and then be unashamed to ask others to join us. That was sort of the first 20 years of self-help. With a lot of help from people who gave us resources, we made loans, and ordinary people made us look like geniuses. In 1999 to 2000, we discovered something that has really changed my life and changed self-help. Is we learned that preaching the necessity of building wealth was not enough. We also had to have a measure of protecting wealth added to our mission statement, because we found that there were finance companies who were so destructive in poor communities that they were undoing any of the progress that people had made before then. And using my, let me tell you how it came for me, the first introduction to subprime mortgage lending, because I always thought self-help is basically a subprime mortgage lender. We make loans to families that have credit blemishes that could not qualify for other financial institutions. Well, that's the definition of what it meant to be a subprime lender. It wasn't called that back in the early 80s. In 1999, this borrower came in my office, and he told me that he had a loan with a company called the Associates. Anybody here remember or know the Associates? You know, when I would ask this question in 1999, 50% to 75% in African American churches, they all knew the Associates because that's where the dominant home loans were being made from this company. I didn't know it. This guy comes in my office and he says, I've got this home loan with the Associates and they won't let me pay it off. I looked at him and I said, you know, I was trained in law. I can't claim to be a very good lawyer, but that can't be. That's just not legal. He said, well, I've tried 3 times to pay off this loan and they won't let me pay it off. And I said, I was quite patronizing, I'm embarrassed to say. I said, bring your paperwork in and let me see it tomorrow. So he came back the next day and brought his paperwork in and showed me the loan that he had gotten 10 years earlier. And the loan he had refinanced a $29,000 loan, and right there on the paperwork it showed that he had been charged $15,000 in upfront fees to refinance that $29,000 loan. So when he walked out of that closing, he now owed $44,000, not $29,000. I calculated the payments. Had he made a self-help home loan over those 10 years, the payments he had made would have completely paid off the $29,000, and he would have built up $10,000 in a savings account. Instead, he was in my office saying, my balance is still $43,000, and I am in foreclosure, and they want to take my home. So I'm already, you know, I told you I had red hair. What I didn't tell you is I really have a hot temper. So I'm getting wired up, and I said, well, I'm going to call this office in Dallas that services your loan and see if we can figure out what's going on. And I picked up the phone and started to make the call. And this guy looked at me and said, there's one more thing I need to tell you, Martin. He says, the reason I can't lose my home is not because I helped build it with my own hands, which I did. He said, but the real reason is that I have a 9-year-old daughter who lost her mother 3 years ago, and this home is the only connection that my daughter will ever have to her mother. So I'm like, okay, I'm a little bit wired up. I make the call, and we have 5 minutes with this, you know, a low-level loan servicing representative for the Associates based in Dallas, Texas. And after 5 minutes, she says to me, I'm not going to tell you what it would cost to pay off this guy's loan. After all, you're just a competitor trying to steal my borrower. And I just snapped. I told her, I said, you've picked the wrong fight with the wrong person at the wrong time. If it takes me the rest of my life, we will drive you into the damn Atlantic Ocean. And I hung up. And I got off the phone and started doing the research, and I found out this is the largest finance company in the world. They have 20,000 mortgage loans per year in North Carolina. And I'm thinking, okay, this may be a little bigger push to the Atlantic Ocean than I thought. And that was the beginning, really, of this movement that came together in North Carolina to start an anti-predatory lending legislation. And yes, self-help was sort of one of the backbones in putting together a coalition that included all of North Carolina's credit unions, all of the banks. Now, do you know how infrequent it is that banks and credit unions agree on anything at all? They hate each other. But they were all in there. The mortgage bankers, the realtors, the AARP, the housing groups, the community development groups, Habitat, the church council. I mean, we had everybody. By the time this coalition was finished, we had 3 million citizens out of 5 million voters in North Carolina to pass a law that would stop predatory lending practices and drive the associates out of business in the state of North Carolina. And the bill passed the North Carolina House and Senate with only 1 dissenting vote in the Senate and 2 in the House. It's an amazing thing. That was the beginning of us being drawn into a battle to try to protect people's homes from being lost. And I've got to tell you, it's been quite a journey. And the Center for Responsible Lending, which is this advocacy side of self-help that grew out of it, has been an amazing story. Here's some of the pieces for the socially responsible investment crowd. Immediately after this legislation was passed in North Carolina, which only did 3 or 4 modest things to stop really abusive home lending, it cut the amount of fees you could charge on a mortgage loan from 50% to 5%. But even that was terrible because the average fee on a standard loan was 1%. So I went home, I was in tears after the legislation was passed, feeling like I had let the people down. And you would have thought that we had destroyed free market capitalism as the world knows it once this bill was passed, what I heard from all of the industry trade groups from around the country. Immediately after the bill was passed, a big company announced that they were purchasing the associates. So I'm thinking, oh my God, we just made this claim that we're going to drive them into the Atlantic Ocean. And Citibank announced that they were acquiring the associates. And so I called them up. I said, you guys do not know what you're getting into. We're going to drive you into the Atlantic Ocean if that's what it takes. And it was an amazing thing. So I had, and Tim will remember this, the socially responsible investment movement nationally joined with us. They helped set up a website. It was called Tell City. And at one point, we had 10,000 emails per month going directly to the CEO of Citibank that basically had this message: if you are willing to steal from your customers, you will eventually steal from your shareholders, and we're not going to put up with it. I was invited by a coalition called Responsible Wealth that represented Warren Buffett and Bill Gates Sr., whom I've never met. But they had a shareholder resolution that was very modest. It said that for big companies, you must set the compensation for CEOs not based on this one factor, but just you have to include the factor of social accountability and responsibility in neighborhoods as one factor in setting the CEO's compensation. So I got to go and speak in Carnegie Hall with all the mink stoles. I mean, there was a lot of money in that room representing the shareholders of Citibank. There were armed guards at each of the exits with machine guns. And the speakers, little old me, I'm down in the audience, in the aisle, in the dark, in Carnegie Hall, and the CEO of Citi, Sandy Weil at the time, was up on stage with the light of God on him. But by the end of the little 10 minutes of saying to the shareholders, you can never get your reputation back once you ruin it. Once you do really evil things in a community, which is what this lender was doing, you can't get it back. The cost to you as a shareholder is uncalculable. And eventually that crowd stood up and gave me this standing ovation for challenging Citibank in New York City to just do the right thing. But I couldn't have done that without the socially responsible investment movement. And Tim, that's why I thank you and all of your colleagues in the field. And eventually, over 5 years, Citibank changed their practices and completely shut down the associates' operation. They could not continue to do that business. Citigroup, to their credit, did the right thing, although it took them some cajoling along the way. And we were calling for boycotts of their credit cards and other things. But eventually they changed it and made it acceptable. Well, all of the executives from the associates left and went to form a new company called Full Spectrum. Anybody ever heard of Full Spectrum? It's the subprime lending operation of a company called Countrywide Home Loans. Anybody ever heard of Countrywide Home Loans? Well, I want to announce tonight, it's has nothing to do with the Atlantic Ocean, but the Center for Responsible Lending has launched an investigation and monitoring initiative on Countrywide Home Loans. Countrywide is the largest home loan lender in America today. They brag that they touch more families of color and more families of modest means than any other lender in the nation. Unfortunately, Countrywide's lending practices are so awful and so reckless that every single one of those families they touch, they endanger to lose their homes. When other lenders were stepping away in the current subprime, you've all heard the term subprime. Self-help and the Center for Responsible Lending, we've been talking about this for about 10 years now. But we didn't get a whole lot of traction until just recently. So when the folks in the subprime industry say to me, Martin, if we pass any of these rules that you recommend, it'll destroy the industry. I'm now in the position of being able to come back to them and say, the fact that you didn't put any boundary ethical rules in place has destroyed the industry by itself. You did it to yourself. And here's the message of why do I care? Subprime mortgage loans have grown from being 3% of the total mortgage loans made in America 10 or 12 years ago to last year being 29% of all first mortgage loans made in America. You say, well, what's so bad about that? Well, here's why it's so bad. Subprime mortgage loans are structured, almost 80% of them, in the following way. The loan has a fixed payment at an 8.5% interest rate for the first 2 years. At the end of the first 2 years, the interest rate jumps to 12.5%. The payment on this loan jumps by 30 to 40% in 80% of the subprime loans. So I call these are exploding arm loans, and then it floats from then on the next 28 years. They call it a 2-28 mortgage loan. And many of you here have never heard of that. You would never consider getting that as your loan. But that is the dominant product in the subprime mortgage market. So here's why it really is troubling, is that for African American and Latino families, between 50 and 60% of all mortgage loans made in America to African American families of all types are these exploding arm loans. If you get one of these loans, you cannot survive it. In the third year, you will face such hardship that you will be at the verge of losing. I call them foreclosure loans. They're designed to fail. They really were designed to make borrowers refinance every 2 years, where the lender could collect another $10,000 in fees. So the racial impact of this, we're not talking about the poorest of the poor, we're talking about the wealthiest of Black and Latino families. That this is basically two different paths in America. One is for predominantly white borrowers who get the kind of mortgages that you see at conventional banks. And then for families of color, they get loans that are unsustainable. Now, my Black friends say to me, well, Martin, thank God they expanded so much that they got so many white people that now America has to pay attention to it, because they wouldn't pay attention if it was just us. And it's sad that there really is some truth to that. The community impact of this, and so this is my most pessimistic part of this presentation is that the scale of lost homes and the lost family wealth for the families who are in these loans is 10 to 20 times the scale of the devastation caused by Katrina. But this is an invisible storm that happens one family at a time, one neighborhood at a time, all across America in very invisible terms. But the loans are concentrated. And the final piece that makes it really devastating is for subprime loans, they are concentrated in modest income neighborhoods, both white, black, and Latino. When you have one foreclosure in a neighborhood, that family's going to lose $50,000 to $60,000. But the neighbors around it will each one lose $3,000 of home loan value just for being near a foreclosure. So in a normal, low-density urban neighborhood, you have 50 houses nearby. In a more concentrated neighborhood in Chicago, it would be 100 houses. So we're talking about $150,000 to $300,000 of neighborhood wealth that is lost for each and every foreclosure. In Cleveland, there are neighborhoods where on one block there are 27 foreclosed, boarded up homes. Who do you think will buy the unboarded up house on a block that has 27 foreclosed properties, or even 2 or 3 if there are drug dealers already operating there or other folks who have moved into these boarded up houses? So I'm telling you, we're facing the greatest crisis of family wealth for black and Latino and poor white homeowners that this nation has ever faced, and it will all unravel within the next 3 to 5 years. So yes, I get a little upset about it. And when I think about Countrywide, which is the largest subprime lender in America, the largest home loan lender, and I think about their CEO, who last year earned $120 million, not counting his stock options. Do you know how many borrowers you have to screw out of $5,000 each in order to pay that one man's salary? Anybody here do the math? 24,000 families have to be hit with an abusive fee, net fee. So forget the cost. It has to be a net fee of $5,000 on 24,000 families across America to pay this one reckless subprime lending machine. Countrywide has outright refused to modify these loans that are going to put people in jeopardy. And so we're going to take them on. If you have friends or family members that are looking for a home loan, do them a favor and advise them to stay away from Countrywide home loans. So I'm going to wrap up. I tell people I'm angry, and I'm angry in a way that I have not been angry since I was a teenager. Some of you have heard my personal story, but I grew up in a predominantly, almost completely black community on the south side of Greensboro. My dad was this really strong Jesse Helms Republican. My mother was a Democrat who said that her only political goal in life was to cancel my father at every election. And so if I seem confused politically to you, I come by it naturally. My friends growing up were all young African-American boys. We played basketball together. And there were 2 experiences that really helped form who I am as a person, and I think inform part of what self-help is as an institution. The first was that I played Little League football on a church football team. Okay, now you just imagine how tough and mean and muscular I was back then. Half of my church football team was black, mostly from my neighborhood, and the other half was white. I was 11 years old. I went with my very, very best friend to join that church. It was a big Baptist church in downtown Greensboro. The minister talked to both of us for an hour, had a captive audience. And finally he looked at me and he said, "Martin, we're really pleased to have you join this church. We're looking forward to it. We're so happy. I know your parents." And then the minister turned to my friend and he said, "And I'm really sorry to tell you this, but you can't join this church because of the color of your skin." And my friend, this young 11-year-old child, had tears well up in his eyes and these few drops rolled down his cheek, and he looked at the minister And he said, but I'm just a kid. I'm just a kid. And I've never forgotten it. I don't think I ever will. The second incident also involved one of my very best friends, this time in high school. We jumped forward. Greensboro was the very first city in the South to announce that it would desegregate when Brown versus Board of Education was decided by the Supreme Court in 1954. But it was one of the very last cities in the South to actually get it done. One of my neighbors was this really good friend. He wanted to run for student government. My high school had just desegregated. We had 10% of the students were black from two different cities in North Carolina. He wanted to run for treasurer and wanted me to run for vice president. And I was thinking, okay, I can do the calculation here. There are 10% black students. This doesn't seem like a very good move. And I remember thinking then, even as a young high school kid, that it takes a lot of guts to ask someone to be an ally, and it's a lot easier for me to just say yes. And I did, and we ran and we won, and it's the last elected political office I've ever wanted. And I'm convinced it was because of my friend, not because of me, that we won that election. This kid was the most charismatic person I've ever met. When he would speak, you'd get chills up and down your spine. And I really thought that he could be president one day. But that day never came because he was killed on a playground behind my house. He was tutoring young kids in basketball. Somebody shot him. And so I made this pledge. I said, for the rest of my life, I will try to live for the two of us. And much of self-help's work is a tribute to the children of my youth. And my friend would not stop fighting now, and neither will I, even when it gets really tiring. So I'm mad, and I'm mad in a really personal way. What I think people don't realize is just how expensive it is to be poor or black. In poor communities, we have convenience stores instead of grocery stores. In poor communities, we have check cashers instead of ATMs. In poor communities, we have pawn shops instead of bank branches. In poor communities, we have ambulances that take people to the hospital instead of health insurance.